Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener. In this podcast, we're hoping to explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And as tradition has it, this week's podcast is sponsored by, and this one I'm particularly excited by, a fighting wine I picked up from a petrol station in Poland. So if we don't make it through this podcast, you'll know never to get a bottle of wine from a petrol station in Poland. In terms of today's topic, though, I think in previous podcasts we have teased the audience by talking about leadership, management at command at different points, and so it felt only right that we actually properly did a podcast on command, leadership, and management. And as the business representation, I guess, in this podcast, if we talk about leadership and management, then I feel very comfortable about the differences between those and the place for those. But actually, when you start throwing command in there, I think that's a word that is used less, and dare I say it, is almost a dirty word in the civilian world, because that sounds very military, shooting at people. Gareth, command, leadership, management. Tell me about it. What, maybe start with those and what your definition of each of those is.
So I think you're right. The term command comes up far less in the commercial world. And I happened to be looking yesterday on Amazon Books at how many books have the title leadership in them, or leader, how many books have management in them, and how many have command in them. And it will be no surprise to our listeners that leadership wins by a country mile. There are hundreds of thousands of leadership books. I think there were 57,000 books with the term management or manager in them. And command, there were very few.
Do you think, I mean, here's the elephant in the room, leadership is sexy. People always talk about great leaders. Management is almost, there's leaders, and then there's managers.
A bit mundane. And,
yeah. And I mean, and then command, as I say, command is this idea.
It's intimidating, I think.
Well, it feels almost a dirty word, because command, leadership has room for debate and discussion. The implication is command, there is no room for this. I am in charge, this is what we're going to do. So rather than me take you away, maybe we start with command. Talk about your definition of command in this case.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you. I think there is almost a fetishism around leadership, and people like to talk about leadership. I think sometimes at the expense of some other really important aspects. And command, for me, is one of those. So all three terms are quite often used synonymously. People will interchange the term manager, leader, commander, but they are discrete, they are different, and they have to be balanced. And we'll get into sort of definitions and discuss your view on it and my view on it in more detail in a moment. But leadership's about getting people to do things. Management is about allocation of resources. Command is, for me, the organisational glue that makes management and leadership work. So what do I mean by that? It is the explicit or implicit understanding of the balance of accountability, authority and responsibility. And I've mentioned that before. So command is what empowers people to make leadership decisions or managerial decisions.
So we should be clear, command is not the idea I command you to do something. Command is the sense of it is a role. So in my world, I was speaking to my CEO today. My CEO has the position of command in terms of he has the authority. He is where, as it were, the buck stops. Is that what your sense is, or that's your meaning of command in that sense, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly it. And I think unlike management and leadership, or the term manager and leader, those are subjective. So we talk about people's ability to lead, people's ability to manage, and you can debate what's good and what's bad, and of course each situationally dependent, etc., etc. Whereas command is less about individual, so you can't as easily judge an ability to command, because command intrinsically requires a relationship across an organisation. So it's about the understanding of who has authority over somebody else.
You can be a leader or a manager at any level, but you can only be a commander or command when you are accountable for a specific group or thing.
Yeah, and so it would be very difficult to sort of talk about an individual's ability to command, because without the organisation that they're commanding, how do you judge it? Whereas you can talk about an ability to lead or an ability to manage, more sort of abstract from the organisation.
Can I just say, I don't know how far the microphone goes, but the fact that your dog is snoring loudly, I think is magnificent. That at least there's one audience member who thinks this is nonsense. The idea that we make these differentiations, the difference between manager and leader for me, and again, to recap from sort of my general take on this, is manager is a sense of I have a group of people I'm responsible for, and there are a set of, in inverted commas, hygiene tasks that I need to do.
Yeah.
I need to meet with them regularly. I need to make sure they get paid. I need to check on their welfare. I need to see if they're performing. That's a manager. It's sort of a, hygiene is the wrong word, but it's a mechanical process to some degree.
Governance.
If you fulfill it. Leadership is the one that, and that was great when you said at the beginning about fetishizing it, because I talk a lot about it. So I'm thinking, oh, damn.
I mean, it is important.
Well, no, but I think your point is right, and I think it's this difference between the romanticizing of something versus the discussion to make it useful. But for me, leadership is the ability to influence a group of people in a positive way to achieve a goal, whether you have authority or not. Sometimes you do have authority, sometimes you don't. I want to poke you and say, is command just another word for the person in authority, and therefore does it lose value at that point? Is it mildly interesting that there's this differentiation between someone who influences versus or is there something more about command? Is there something that's more and unique and different about it?
So I think, firstly, I'll come back to you on your definition of leadership. I don't think it has to be positive. I think you can still get people to do things in a negative way.
Agreed.
We've talked about Adair's balls on this podcast before, so team, task and individual. You can do really, really well at the task at the detriment of the team.
Yeah. We lost a few people, but we succeeded, so it's all okay.
And you can absolutely get people to do things through a didactic, bullying, sort of forcing people to do things, and it achieves tasks.
Well, I was going to say, you can. What I've found as a diversion, I've met lots of people who use that approach. The really interesting thing is, before anyone out there thinks, shouting at people works, they said so, it works briefly.
Yeah, and there are...
and it works in situations. I mean, the positive bit, maybe the other piece of that, and I agree with you, there are many ways to get people to do things. The leadership, the positive is the idea that it is sustainable, repeatable, and all sorts of other things come from it. In other words, good leaders beget good leaders because they're role models. But now I've seen this idea that when people, they use poor ways to motivate people, and you can get away with that for a short period of time. And often you can even fool yourself into thinking, look how good a job I'm doing.
Yeah.
But the moment the push comes to shove, or the opportunity to push that person over the cliff comes, they're all gone. So generally...
There are, of course, times where a very, very robust didactic form of leadership is very valuable. So obviously in the military we always refer back to that, leading troops into dangerous situations. But I think more clearly for me is emergency services. When there is clear and present danger, being nice and encouraging people and developing people is the wrong approach. What you need is a very didactic, get back, stay back.
So are we? I mean, I was going to come back and say I still don't feel that I've scratched the command itch.
No, I didn't answer your question.
But maybe this is a lead into this, which is commanders will have to make decisions sometimes. I mean, in the military sense, but we should relate it to the business sense. But commanders sometimes have to make decisions that lead to bad outcomes for the team in a way that the other roles we have described are naturally less inclined to do so, or less inclined. As in, you may well be a military commander and say, we have to run up that beach and 80% of us won't make it up there, but we're still going to do it, guys. That is a command decision.
Yeah, I think for me that you can still be a leader, or you are still a leader. I don't think these are discrete roles.
Right.
I don't think you're a commander or a leader or a manager. I think everybody is a little bit leader, a little bit manager, a little bit commander.
And you can score
depending on
positive
where you are.
or negative.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
So
that balance needs to be struck. And I think that in its essence is what command is. Ultimately starting at the apex of that organisation, so the CEO or the general or the admiral or whatever, but filtering down to make sure that everybody is empowered. And we use the word empowerment a lot, but we don't really talk about how empowerment works. But everybody is empowered to the right amount to have accountability for their actions, to somebody or to a board or to a governance body, so they are held accountable for how they carry out activities. They are given an amount of resource, whether it's access to money or time or people, to manage things. And then leadership is, about getting people to do things. And you've already alluded to the fact that that can be an explicit role, or it can be about, influencing people around you. You can lead your boss.
So it's interesting. I mean, what you're really saying is that I thought the statement, you are not a manager, a leader, or in command. There's a mix of all of those. And the command piece is more in the area of accountability and resources and marshalling those things. So, in the Second World War, they talk a lot about leaders. There's sort of Patton, who is the stand-up, waves his gun around.
Yeah.
He was, of course, a commander, but more of the leader. And then there's Eisenhower, who you never see waving his gun around. He is in command, and he cared about how many landing craft they had.
Yeah, something in that. You can start to get after that sort of triumvirate of leadership, management, command. And of course, for these key individuals, we've used generals in conflict as an example there, but if you're the CEO of an organisation, I think there is the people that you are interacting with, your immediate staff around you, you're going to be far more influential in the way that you act, in the way you behave, than people who are on the other side of the world that get to read stuff you write once a month and see you on a Zoom call or something. So, and I'm thinking back to military commanders, when I was working at brigade level. So I was part of what they call the principal planning group. So the senior leaders within the brigade headquarters, all working to the brigade commander. But the brigade commander, commanding 6,500 people and all of the resources, who are on different ships, possibly in different countries, managing helicopters and aircraft and vehicles and political lines to take and all sorts of other things, also was day to day being watched by the command headquarters of about 200 people, and so was in a direct leadership role, because the way he presented himself, the way he behaved, the things that you see when he's not standing up and giving a set of orders, but he's having a chat in the canteen, or catching somebody in a corridor. He's leading by example. But to people on the other side of the brigade who are just on the other end of a radio or on the other end of a set of orders, there isn't that direct, tangible leadership.
I wonder whether there's. I mean, it's funny if you said to me, "Have I ever been in command?" I would say, well, I mean, obviously a command is a CO, but actually, I think the reality is, I'm a VP of product and I have a product organisation. There's command there, but the bit that was interesting, and I guess this is one of the things that I was poking at a bit, which is it's great we have these terms and these ideas of differences. So what? What do we get? And I wonder whether the first thing that I'll throw out, and then I'd love to sort of get your so what on this is, the first thing is a different way of thinking and perhaps a broader way of thinking. So the example I have is, in my world, I care about everything within the product organisation. That is, from beginning to end, I care about all of that. Whereas my CEO has to care about that and everything else. And so it's a different, higher level view of more things, and it's a portfolio, and it's the spreadsheets matter more. I'm not a big spreadsheet fan because I don't need to be. He has to have spreadsheets of balance, of profit, of loss, of headcount, of all these kinds of things. So I wonder whether for me at least, not that this helps people, but command, when you are in command, the first thing you have to do is say, how must I think differently? Because by definition, I am now in charge of more than one thing, and that demands a different way of thinking.
I think you can probably still be in command of just one thing, but it's far, far simpler, and the command aspect of leadership management and command becomes less important. I think something that Brigadier John said in the last podcast we recorded, where he was talking about boxes, and he was talking about giving subordinate leaders, commanders, managers, boxes, the boundaries within which they work, and then allowing them to do that however they feel is justified. And I think that's why this is important, because we don't talk about command that much in the commercial world, but we do talk about changing the structure. We talk about flatter structures, we talk about empowerment, we talk about psychological safety and all these terms. And the reality is that unless you talk about command, unless you talk about the relationships between the way people behave, the way that they share problems, who owns the responsibility? Not who gets shouted at when it goes wrong, but who actually is responsible for the decision, who is accountable, who has the authority. Unless you talk about those things, you can talk about good and bad leadership, you can talk about management and spreadsheets and allocation of resources, but unless people are empowered by being in control of their little boxes and they know what those are, the whole idea of psychological safety and empowerment doesn't really work.
Well, you said something very, very important there, actually, and there's a couple of thoughts that come up, but one thing that's really important is you said people need to talk about the authority and the accountability.
Yeah.
And I want to pick up on that, because I bet any organisation you would go to, if you went to someone in command or a senior leader and said, does everyone understand what they're accountable for? The answer would be yes, and the smart ones would then pause and say probably. And the reason is because I think there is an assumption of accountability, but actually it is quite rare to say, let's talk about what you own and what you are accountable for. Let's talk about what your box is. What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do?
Yes.
What are your expected parameters? I think talking about it, which seems very unsexy, is actually incredibly powerful and valuable, and is useful as a leader, a manager, and a commander. There's one other thing, and I'll drop it in, but I know you've spent lots of time talking to people about sort of the facets of what makes good command. So I want to come back to that. But this is something I've found really important. And this is perhaps Well, I wanted to make the point about command, but I think this is true about leadership and management as well. And that is, how do you ensure the next generation of people who will take over from you are able to take over from you? And so today we're talking at a theoretical level about these roles and what that means. Another thing I've come across a lot in my time is that there's this air gap between how do you become one of those. Like, I remember in my world, the difference between a product manager and a group product manager and a director is a big jump. You go look at the definitions and you go look at all the really good stuff out there about what's the difference between a director. It talks about a different mindset, different goals. One of the things that's very clear to me is, how do people get the experience to do that? I was talking to someone recently who says, well, I'm a product manager, but I want to be a director one day. And every time I go for an interview for a director role, they say, well, you're not a director. And then they say, what experience do you have? And you say, well, I don't have the experience. So one of those things is for people out there who are managers or in command or good leaders, is you need to think about how the people that work for you will make that next step up. And the way that I often do this is, how do you give them that experience? The next time I'm presenting to the CEO, how can I get one of my team to do the presentation, to see what is it like to present to the CEO? How can I get them to turn up to one of the board meetings to hear what the board are asking us about? Another one of those things, and that classic phrase we use, maybe a topic for another podcast, but how do you have succession planning and how do you have people come up? Anyway, that was a diversion.
No, I think there's a really interesting point there, and that was about emulation of other people's roles and expansion of experience. And there's a really interesting dynamic in the way that the different armed services of the military operate. And it's something I looked at when I started doing the research for my master's degree, which is all about the relationship between leadership and organisational culture, specifically within the armed forces. But you've got the Army and the Royal Marines is very, very similar, that operates in a very complex environment. You have to, because of the character of the way that conflict unfolds in the land environment, delegate command, leadership, decision making down to very small teams, because it's a dynamic environment, things change very quickly, and no one really has a handle on exactly what's going on everywhere. And I have a really sort of personal story around that, which is when I was in Afghanistan, we were engaged with the enemy. We took some casualties and we needed to fight through and extract from our position. And so we called for indirect fires. And we had GMLRS, so guided multiple launch rocket systems, which are proving themselves at the moment in Ukraine, coming in on the enemy position. But I needed to make sure that my own troops were far enough away from the blast zone of the incoming rounds. But I didn't know exactly where my forward line were, where the Marines that were the furthest forward engaged with the enemy were. And I also didn't know their exact situation. I didn't know whether they had the ability to get up and run back and be in the safe zone, or whether it was safer for them to continue to suppress the enemy and take the risk. And so the only thing I could do was pass the information down to them. So there are rounds coming in on this point of ground in this time, and you need to be this far away by that point. I couldn't go and drag them away. I couldn't tell them, to be in positions, because I didn't know where they were. And so there was an empowerment piece that had to happen. Interestingly, in the air environment, it's very different. So the air environment is far less complex. There is lots of open space. Things move faster, and so it becomes far more about mechanics. It becomes about angles and speeds, which is why aircrew are renowned for being very, very good at doing quick arithmetic in their head. And in the maritime environment, in the Navy, you have a very different dynamic again. So it's very two-dimensional. Of course, there is air threats and there are subsurface threats, but there isn't a huge amount going on the surface other than water and ships, and then missiles flying around. But what you don't have in the air environment and the maritime environment is this ability to grow confidence in command that you do in the land environment, because you start with very small teams that are making complex decisions very early on, and then those teams just get bigger as you promote. So I was commanding a troop of about 35 Marines. We spoke to John last week. He started doing that in the artillery, but still commanding a troop, and now commands 33,000, but has graduated through that. Whereas in the air environment, you've only got aircrew that fly aircraft in combat.
Yeah, it's very...
And in the maritime environment, it's even worse, because you have leadership, but your ship only goes in one direction. And you only get to be the commander of a ship once you've promoted through. So there's this sort of challenge that the Navy have, which is how do they develop leaders and commanders?
So I was gonna, as you were going through that story, and I think the military is held up as these crazy unique people, as in this isn't relevant to the business world, and while things are very different, though, I think the thing that is interesting about the military is that the extremity that presents itself says you need to be really good at this. So there's an edge to it that I think maybe in business you don't get as much. But as we were talking through this, one of the things that struck me was, and I'm going to go back to my old favourite of I don't read books, which as we've discussed in previous episodes, but I think one of the things that makes me nervous about reading textbooks or self-help books or whatever they might be is the idea that there is your recipe for success. You read this book and you'll be successful. What you have just brilliantly articulated is that command varies in almost any dimension you can look at it. It varies in the military in terms of the service you're in. It varies at the level you're at, and it changes.
Whether you're in conflict or not. Well,
Indeed. And so it strikes me there isn't a handbook that says do these three things and you'll be great at command. So I hadn't even expected to ask this question. The point about every single topic we've discussed over the last however many hours we've done this, hopefully many more hours, is we can give examples, we can talk about typical cases, we can give guidelines, but honestly, at the end of the day, if you're a muppet, it's not going to work for you. So here's the $1 million question. You've read every book in the world, you've seen every video, you've been on the battlefront, or you're a CEO, you've worked at 5 companies. You know the principles of command. You know what is the magic? How do you prepare people to be not muppets?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's like I can give you the 20 things to be a great commander or in command or a great CEO, and you can understand them perfectly and still be terrible.
Yeah.
Our job, I think it's fair to say our job, whether it's sort of you coaching people or me as I work on the day-to-day, is to say that these are the things I can't control, but I still need to train to somehow overcome that. So, okay, a simple list of what makes good commanders or good leaders is not good enough.
No.
What's the magic ingredient?
So I think...
And by the way, this is a very serious question because I have no idea what the magic ingredient is.
The first thing is to recognise that we tend to focus on senior positions, and so you've got CEOs and C-suite professionals who are reading all these books and are encouraged to read books and go on courses, but I think the first thing is to recognise that everybody in an organisation has a level of command, a level of management, and a level of leadership. And there's a really good way of finding out whether the organisation has command right is to start exploring when things go wrong. And I think a really good example is the lowest level. If you imagine a sort of restaurant chain, let's take a coffee shop.
I was about to say, let's take a non-specific coffee shop before we get into legal trouble.
What does the barista, who is probably a part-time, maybe a student doing it as a job to pay the bills whilst they're studying, it's not their vocation, it's not their long-term career aspiration. What do they do when a customer complains? And it's not just about do they have a good customer manner and can they be polite, because of course that's important, but it's about how much confidence do they have in rectifying the problem, the complaint. Do they know where the limits of what they're allowed to do are? Can they give away free stuff? Can they use resource? Do they have the authority to make decisions about how the organisation is going to solve this problem? And that can be call handler, it can be somebody on the shop floor, it doesn't matter. Everybody in the organisation can be pushed into a position where, unless there's been a discussion about what the limits of what they can and can't do are, they're going to be reticent to do stuff.
I agree with you. I mean, I think what you're saying is we can have a checklist about what makes a great commander or a great CEO. You can do that. There's value in that. You can actually go further and enable more. You could say, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. Those are all good things. The going back to the Muppet factor though. In that coffee shop case, it's you have the sliding doors moment where the barista could shrug his shoulders and say, "Don't care, never going to see you again."
Yeah.
Or the sliding doors moment where the barista says, "I care, I'm now going to use my skills." I wonder whether the sort of the magic ingredient here is you can provide all the tools for someone to become good at this stuff, but then at some point you either have people who have those values or don't have those values. And I remember, I think it was the first podcast we did where I surprised you with the question, what were the values of the Royal Marines again? And you went, yeah, I remember this. But I wonder whether that's the next bit you go to, because, you know, I've got 5 people in the room who say, I want to be a great leader. I can tell you all the textbook stuff. I can give you all the examples you want.
Yeah.
But if one of them says, I don't really want to be here, or I'm only here to enrich myself, all bets are off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a risk then that you default to, well, I've got to idiot-proof my organisation, so I'm not going to allow people to make these decisions. And that's the wrong approach.
Yes.
Actually, people are generally, and I'm a massive optimist, people are generally good and want to be good, and you've got to empower them and motivate them.
Completely agree.
And a barista who, isn't going to do it for the rest of their lives, it's not their career, can still be motivated such that they treat problems like it's a personal challenge. They believe in the identity of the
mission, the vision.
Well,
what we've done is looped back on doing all of this stuff that we talk about well is like a recipe.
Yes.
My wife can make a cake with the same ingredients as I do, and hers is delicious and good looking, and mine is horrible and not the same ingredients.
Yeah.
There we've just said, you need to understand these roles. You need to have the skills and the education, for want of a better word, to understand how to do them, how to be good. You need to have the values that support these roles in the truest sense. And then the last bit that you said, and you implied, when you said the barista who is just about to go back to university and will never come back to this coffee shop again, I would argue it loops us back to who's in command, who are the leaders and who are the managers, because I would argue probably in most cases the barista who says my manager couldn't give less of a toss about me, doesn't care what I do, frankly I'm just cheap thing. Then when the customer has the problem, they look around and go,
not my problem.
Not my problem.
Yeah.
The manager that says, guys, I know we're only in a coffee shop, but we're here to make people happy. That's what we're here for. You might like. The next time the problem comes, the barista says, oh, maybe I'll do it. hand me that handbook again about what I can do. So
I think the other thing is, of course, is having really clear boundaries as well, so that people feel comfortable about where the limits of that is. So it's not just do everything you can to make them happy, because
absolutely,
you risk them giving away all of your stock. But it's people are comfortable when they have certainty, and so there's this relationship, and this is why command is about relationships, because it's about how much command does your subordinate have, where are the limits, and do they know those limits, where they can hand the problem to you. So they can say, I'm terribly sorry that this has happened to you, sir or madam. I can't resolve this, but let me go and find the person who can. Along comes the manager and says, this is not the service that you should have expected, and therefore this is what we're going to do for you. And there's always going to be a need for escalation as the problems become bigger. But, and I tell organisations this all the time, a problem that arises, problems happen. Things happen in everyday life. Mistakes get made, balls get dropped. A problem between a customer and an organisation is actually an opportunity, because a problem that is handled well and solved leaves the customer feeling happier and has a closer relationship with that organisation than the customer that didn't have a problem at all.
You were right on the edge of me calling you out for that it's not a problem, it's an opportunity, because I'm never a fan of that. However, I entirely agree with you. I mean, throughout my time as a product manager, often what rightly we do is when there is a problem, we will be the ones, and as the VP of product, I will frequently be the one that stands in front of the customer and says, I'm terribly sorry, this went wrong, this is what we need to fix it. But your point about, by solving a customer's problem, you are, and it is slightly weird, you will build a stronger relationship with them. I think that's absolutely true. But I also, even that case, I think is a really interesting example from a business perspective of, imagine if you could build that kind of a relationship with a customer or someone you work with when you don't have that problem. Now, the reality is you don't. And you don't because you don't have time and there is no clear reason to. But I think that's a really interesting thought to play with, which says, what I think, to break that down, why is it that the customer that's had the problem that you've solved for is happier? Well, because they have had an opportunity to genuinely see, are you going to dig in for me? Are you going to put yourself on the line? Are you going to go the extra mile? Are you professional? Are you logical? Are you intelligent? That's the reason why people have solved it. It's not because, oh, you solved my problem, I like you. It's, I saw what you did, I saw the outcome, and that demonstrates to me you are a partner to me, and that's really valuable. So that's a really interesting thought, and I think this going back to some of these roles for leaders and managers and people in command, where you talked about communicating with other people. In a weird way, if you are successful, you want to communicate those elements you did with the customer you made happy. I am credible. I will dig in. I am a partner. I'm there at the tough times. Those are the kinds of things which will actually create the best relationships, as opposed to these very, I need you transactional, I need you to do a thing.
And I think if you bring it back to, because we're now talking about shop floor level employees at the bottom of the pyramid, if you like. I don't really like talking about pyramids and hierarchies, but they are. It's a different. I think it's a different. Rather than it being a pyramid, it's a different point in the journey. That's probably a better way to say it. I often talk about a sphere of influence with the people who are the shop floor, the people that are exposed to customers, suppliers, other people outside of the organisation are on the edge of this sphere, and then the strategic centre is the CEO and the C-suite, and then you've got kind of middle management somewhere in between. And I think we can explore that in more detail in a different podcast. But what I want to do is talk about how we get from the edge back to the centre, because it's great to say, let's have all our baristas, feeling happy and wanting to motivate customers to be happy and are empowered to do it. But how do you do that? Is it about employing the right people, or is it about setting the right tone?
It has to be a combination. I mean, this goes back to the recipe thing, which is no one self-help book is going to make a duff leader a great leader.
Absolutely not.
It just encourages you to think you're a great leader because you've read the book and you think you're like that person.
And I think there's also a tendency to overestimate the influence that you can have as a leader in the individual actions people take.
Absolutely.
But to underestimate the effect you have on the way people feel about the organisation.
Well, it's this idea about setting an example. It's about, going back to our Second World War, Montgomery made sure that all the troops met him and they all thought he was wonderful and they all thought, I want to fight for him because he's a cool dude. Okay, he can't make them get up, cock the rifle and walk forward, but in fact, a better way of saying this, as when you're in command, when you're at the centre of the sphere, you need to be more sensitive to the levers you can pull in your organisation. We were actually talking about this a little bit earlier before we recorded the podcast, which is within my team, the balance between empowering the team to do something versus, as it were, directing. And it's a combination of these things that I think that have to work. But you've got to be really sensitive. There's a real... We haven't talked about something today, and while it's really fluffy, or some people might think it's fluffy, I think it's really true. In all these roles, particularly in command, I think one of the biggest problems you've got is information overload.
Yeah.
What bit of my sphere should I be looking at? Because it's such a big sphere. I could look over here, feel really happy, but I didn't look over it, it's really bad. Understanding where you should be looking, what problems to solve, is a real problem at the command level. And I'd love to... That's a sort of an interesting... Have some minutes to it, but there's this concept of empathy.
Yeah.
And this concept of listening and hearing what's going on in the world. And maybe empathy isn't even the right word, but part of this is about going to your team and finding out what their problems are.
Yes.
Because the systems that report information to you, all they're going to report is data. They're not going to report what that means.
Yes.
And so, as in command, it is really important that you either have empathy or you have someone on your team with that empathy to be able to, in inverted commas, be vulnerable and listen and be open to the barista saying, I would love to help you, but actually, I'm not allowed to.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I want you to do that. Why aren't you allowed? Wow.
I think that raises a really interesting and important point, which is, when you talk about the decision paralysis, the information overload, the answer to that is relatively self-evident. It's about delegating decision making so that you're not the sole decision maker having to make all the decisions for the whole organisation. The actual way that happens is really quite difficult. And the balance, and this is what we were talking to before we started recording, of understanding what's happening around the organisation without being tempted to micromanage and over control or to restrict other people's freedom of action. And so one of the military principles of command is freedom of action. Allowing people to understand, and we've talked about the mission command kind of idea of understanding what people are trying to achieve but not telling them how to achieve it and what to do. Freedom of action. But equally as important is you as a commander understanding how your people are acting in order to achieve their missions. And so I personally have sort of a quite contrasted experience. My initial troop command, I got it slightly wrong. So I found myself as a spotty, oik 21-year-old straight out of training in that cliched kind of you're the graduate 21-year-old telling a load of fairly experienced Royal Marines, corporals, sergeants, what to do. I found that asking questions about what they were doing and how they were doing things felt intrusive and a little bit patronising and condescending, and that instead I should trust that these Marines know what they're doing. And I got the balance wrong, and I thought my job was all about, oh, I'll plan the mission and I'll make sure that I impart that properly and give the orders, and then I will demonstrate through physical leadership my willingness to go through the same hardship and all of those good things, which are all really important. But I didn't sit down with my corporals or with the Marines and talk to them about how they were solving their tasks. I let them get on with it, but didn't have oversight. Whereas later in my career, when I was the head of a team of about 60 individuals, each of whom had very, very specialist roles and far more technical knowledge than I did, I got the balance far better in that I found myself being forced to go and sit with them and ask them about their jobs and find out what they were doing. And it's knowing what's happening without being tempted to start tweaking it.
I think I agree with most of that. I think the knowing what's happening, and like you, I find myself as I become more senior, just like you say, I'm not going to tell the people on the ground floor how to do their job. And by the way, this isn't me saying you should do that. It's actually very important you don't do that. The empowerment and then get on. But on the other hand, the flip side is it's really important, as you said with New and Troop Command, not to go, well, I couldn't possibly comment on that, or that is not my area to comment on. Actually, I live in a world when I've been in various teams, some of which who were highly sophisticated, highly experienced, and there was no value in me saying, have you thought of doing this? You've got this. There were other teams that were more junior or newer or had different challenges where actually I would have to go back to basics and say, oh, I need to now shift my thinking. A vision or strategy is not of any use to you. You want to know what you need to do tomorrow. Okay, vision and strategy, this is not the week for that. This is the week for how do you write a story.
Yeah.
Again, I think we're going to probably have to wrap it up in a second. We've done this again, and maybe this is unfortunately the lesson from all of these podcasts is this is really difficult. There is no black and white answer. There needs to be curiosity, empathy, a hunger for learning, an ability to be open, and a hope that you'll get there in the end. Celebrate the victories, learn from the failures, and do it together as a team. I don't know. That's all too simple. Well, look, I think that's probably all we're going to cover for now. I have a sneaky feeling we're going to come back and maybe talk, because we kept talking about, well, you can read the blueprint for command, and we didn't actually talk about what those things are. So I wonder whether maybe we revisit that at a future date and actually dive into a bit more. We bounced around a lot, but I think we could do it a bit more regimented. But let's leave it there for now. We'll call this for this episode. Thanks for joining us. If you like what you heard, please tell your friends. We'd also love to have you join in the conversation with your stories, ideas, or suggestions for topics. It does seem like we never ran out of ideas for topics. I think as long as there's alcohol or a strong cup of tea, we'll have a topic. But frankly, we'd love to hear what your topics are or what questions you have. So we're not just sort of in our own echo chamber. And if you want to do that, you can follow us, suggest a future topic, or ask us questions on the Twitter at Battling with Biz. That's one word, and Biz is with a Z. For now, thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye from me.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.